my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Featured in January 2017's Rotarian Magazine, New York Times best-selling author, Andra Watkins chose a crazy way to launch her debut novel, and I'm sure she'll share that with us. She's one of the only living persons to walk the 444-mile Natchez Trace as the pioneers did. She did it with an unconventional wingman, her 80-year-old father. Her life-changing adventure inspired her New York Times best-selling memoir, Not Without My Father, which chronicles their experience. Andra is also the author of 4 other successful books and is an active Rotarian, having served in a number of leadership positions. We learned she was president of her club back in 2012, 2013. And she lives down the South Carolina, Charleston area. So welcome, Andra, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Chip. Thanks so much for having me. I think we've tried twice to get this to come together.
You're absolutely right. We tried last spring, you were going to come live. Then last fall, we decided, I don't know, something happened. So we're just glad you're here.
Okay, well, I'm glad to be here, at least with you virtually from Charleston. I read a book about 2 decades ago called Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose. Have any of y'all read that Pulitzer Prize winning book about the Lewis and Clark expedition to the Pacific Ocean? A lot of people around the United States don't know much about that expedition. If you didn't grow up in a state like Ohio that actually touched the expedition, it wasn't part of state history. So I grew up in South Carolina, and our schools have the distinction down here of trading places with Mississippi and Alabama for having the worst schools in America in South Carolina. So when I had to take U.S. history in the 8th grade, I didn't learn much about Lewis and Clark or anything else. They were this tiny, boring paragraph in my history book. They followed Sacagawea to the Pacific. They came home. That was the end. I memorized that fact to write it on a test because that's how we teach history in America. You just memorize a bunch of boring lists and dates, and as soon as you're tested on it, we forget a bunch of what we learned, don't we? So I forgot about them until I picked up Undaunted Courage almost 20 years ago, and I got a very different picture of that trip. Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, 31 other individuals, mostly 20-year-old dudes, were screwing their way across North America. They were having a really big time on this expedition, and they were writing about it extensively in their journals. They were doing upstanding things too, but they were having a really big time. And if you're a 20-year-old guy, you're really up for having a big time as much as possible. So they had a big time. They made scientific discoveries and recorded them. They drew maps that are still works of art and the most accurate picture of what that landscape looked like in that era. But I thought, wow, if they'd focused on the big time they were having when I was 13, I would have been fascinated. I probably would have majored in history. It's the first time that people from history came to life for me, and I wanted to learn more about them because it's the salacious things that make people interesting, isn't it? It's also the first time I learned how Meriwether Lewis, co-captain of the expedition, died. And if you don't know that story, and since you're all muted, I'll just tell you. His death is one of America's great unsolved mysteries. If you Google his death, Google will tell you that he committed suicide on the Natchez Trace, 70 miles south of Nashville, Tennessee. He was 35 years old. It was 3 years after the expedition ended. The suicide crowd say he couldn't handle being a politician. Imagine that today. So he spiraled into depression and drink, and he shot himself once in the head, but that didn't kill him. So he shot himself again in the gut, and he died. But if you Google Meriwether Lewis murder, you can read for hours all the different conspiracy theories. If you're looking for different conspiracy theories to read on the internet this afternoon about who might have wanted to whack him on the Natchez Trace, because apparently a lot of people wanted to kill him. We don't know what happened that night on the Trace. The official position of the United States government is that he died under mysterious circumstances, so the people in D.C. can't get it together and pick a side even about that. But what we do know happened that night comes from one woman who was there, who changed her story 4 times between the time it happened and the time she died almost 50 years later. Nobody came out from Washington to investigate the death of this American explorer. It wasn't feasible. It was the middle of nowhere in 1809. My cell phone still barely works when I go to his grave on the Trace today. It's still pretty remote. So they dug a hole and they threw him in it. And he lay in this unmarked grave with trash on it for almost 50 years in the middle of Tennessee. In 1848, the Tennessee state legislature decided it was appalling that this American hero was buried in their state without a marker, so they exhumed him and erected the monument that you can see if you visit his grave on the Trace today. I thought that was really sad, because if you didn't grow up in a state that touched that expedition or one of those people, they weren't taught in all U.S. history books until the 1960s. And Lewis wasn't recognized for his contributions to science, which were quite extensive, until 1991, when William Clark was finally officially made co-captain of that expedition by the United States government posthumously, and Sacagawea in New York, Clark's slave who went along on the expedition, were officially recognized for the significant contributions they made to its success. So it took a long time for these people to really be celebrated by their government, and I thought that was sad. So I decided I wanted to write a book about Lewis. I didn't care how he died, but I didn't want to write a history book, because you can't make stuff up, or you're not supposed to when you write history books, and I wanted to make stuff up. So I decided I'm going to exhume him and hang him up between life and death, because he has this mysterious death. What might he do if he could have done something else? He was so young when he died. He's one of the smartest people in the United States. So what might he have done if he could have another adventure? So I gave him another adventure along the Natchez Trace and exhumed one of the awfulest people the United States has ever produced. I'll talk about him toward the end. They hated each other in life, and I made that conflict more current and gave them a new adventure together. And I was so proud of my paranormal historical thriller. There wasn't even a genre for that on Amazon. And agents in New York City say they like unique books, and I believe that. So I pitched it to over 100 of those people, and several of them got back to me and said, wow, you really can write, but this is too unique. We don't know how to sell this. You're going to have to make it less unique. The last person who rejected it said, I grew up in Oregon. I love this book, but Meriwether Lewis cannot do any of the things he's doing in this book. Nobody will believe it, even though I represented the book that turned Abraham Lincoln into a vampire slayer. So when I got that rejection, I thought, nobody in New York City is ever going to buy my little book, baby. But a small press in South Carolina said, we'll publish it. And I wanted everybody to read it, but I had to promote it with a small press to get anybody to read it. So I decided I'm going to do something really audacious to launch this novel. I'm going to walk the 444-mile Natchez Trace Parkway from Natchez, Mississippi to Nashville, Tennessee, with cars, trucks, camper vans in 15-mile increments every day for a little over a month on this highway. And I'll blog about it and show readers where I set scenes in this novel. And surely something will go viral on the internet from pulling this stunt, and it will snowball, and I'll get in the news and on TV. And by the time I stagger across the finish line in Nashville, I will have sold enough books to hit the New York Times bestseller list with my debut novel. I'm the smartest author ever. So even though I couldn't run a mile without falling over, I didn't think it would be hard to walk 15 miles on a highway for more than a month. I mean, it's just walking. That's not hard, right? So I started training on dirt trails around my home in Charleston about 3 months before this novel came out, and I was an idiot. I had no idea how stupid I was. But I had one problem with my grand plan. Have any of y'all been to the Natchez Trace? You probably have if you're from Ohio, because it was used significantly by pioneers in the Ohio River Valley before the advent of steam power. They would float all their goods down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. They would sell them in Natchez or New Orleans, and then they would have to walk home, and they would use the Natchez Trace to walk home. It's a 10,000-year-old road that's older than the pyramids in Egypt. It was a migratory route for animals before native peoples came here and started settling along it. So it's been used for thousands of years as a road, and it was the primary mode of transportation for people in the Ohio River Valley who wanted to get down to New Orleans and back. So these men, primarily men who sold their stuff, would sell all their stuff, tear up their boats, and walk home. And I was mimicking that with my walk. However, I'm girly, and I didn't want to carry all my stuff and sleep on the ground for more than a month. I wanted somebody to drop me off at 1 milepost and pick me up 15 mileposts later and take me to a real bed and a shower so that I could recover. So I needed a wingman. And my husband was my first choice. I love Michael. I didn't want to be away from him for 5 weeks doing this hard thing, but he has a stressful job that still pays for my stupid proclivity to do this. So I could not take off. He could not take off 5 weeks and schlep me around Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. But I have all these girlfriends who were always complaining about their husbands and their children and their jobs. And soccer is this really stressful thing in non-COVID times that they wanted to get away from. So I went to all of them and said, if you go with me for a few days each and help me, we can have our big Thelma and Louise adventure together. And they were all into it, but their husbands, children, employers were not. So I ended up with one friend who could go with me at the beginning for 4 days, leaving a chasm of time, 30 days, and no wingman, and only one name left on my scribbled out list, and it was my 80-year-old father. Now, we all have at least one person in our lives, don't we? And we're usually related to them, and they drive us insane. And for me, that is my dad. He's a nightmare. We've never gotten along. He's that person. When we could go to each other's houses, you'd go in their house and you'd sit there and grit your teeth through every second you had to be in their presence. And then as soon as it was over, you would run out and say, thank God I don't have to do that again for 6 months. But I was desperate. So I drove to his house and I went in there and found him in his recliner. His house was vibrating from the sound of the news because he never wears his hearing aids and he can't hear anything. He had popcorn and peanuts all over himself, all around the chair, giving me a big preview of what I would be living with for 5 weeks as an adult. And I ignored all that. And I zoned in and said, Dad, you're just sitting in this recliner waiting to die. You don't have anything to do. And I finally decided what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be a New York Times best-selling debut novelist. And it is a parent's responsibility to help their children reach their dreams, however long it takes us to figure them out. So will you go with me, Dad, and help me reach my dream? And he said, spending 5 weeks with you sounds horrible. I'm not doing that. So I had to regroup. As a writer, I hadn't put my reader in my story very well, had I? So I went back to my dad and I said, Dad, you are the biggest Southern Gothic man I know. You have all these stories you like to tell. Primarily, you like to tell them to strangers. I've heard them all 5 billion times, but there are all these strangers in these tiny towns along the Natchez Trace who've never heard your stories. So while I'm walking 5 hours or so every day, you can go into those towns and do the Roy show and they'll love you. And there are Southern dining establishments in these towns, Dad. They fry everything to death and it tastes so good. And you can eat as much of that crap as you want and Mom won't know and I won't tell her. Would you like to do that for 5 weeks, Dad? And he said, I can't wait to get started. My people are waiting to meet me. So, To Live Forever was published, and I started walking from milepost 0 on the Natchez Trace outside of Natchez, Mississippi, and I walked for 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, it was 20 degrees and sleeting with sub-zero wind chill in southern Mississippi. Now, in our breakout session, I was talking about how I'd never been exposed to a whole lot of winter as a lifelong Southerner. So for y'all, that would have been nothing. For me, that was a significant weather event I didn't want to be out in all day. And people were following this all over the world, basically telling me to quit and go home because I'd already sold all the books I was going to sell by day 3, and they didn't need me to finish this to prove anything to them. But I knew by the morning of the 3rd day just how stupid this idea was. I trained on dirt trails around my home in Charleston, but the entire Southern Trace goes through swamp. So I plan to walk on the shoulder of the road, but when a road goes through swamp, there really isn't one. So I'd spent the first 30 miles walking on pavement. My hips, knees, and ankles were already on fire from the toll that hard surface was taking on my body, and I could not add additional miles to any day to finish on April 3rd. But I had to be in Nashville that day because Ann Patchett, a famous author, owns a bookstore there, and she said, you can come into my store and talk about this stupidness, but only on the day you finish, and you have to talk about what it was like to walk the trace by yourself as a woman. So I was not going to go into her store and say I quit on the third day because it was cold and my feet hurt. She would have been mad. So I got out there and I walked for 2 days in sleet and sub-zero wind chill. Whatever the weather was, I was out there. A tornado warning, some significant hail was falling all day around me one day. A windstorm was blowing me into the highway one day in front of cars and trucks and camper vans all day. By the middle of the second week, I was in physical agony every second, but the physical agony was nothing compared to the agony of living with my father. He forgot to pick me up one day at milepost 135 north of Jackson, Mississippi. I hadn't seen a car in 2 hours. There's nothing there, and I didn't have a cell signal to call him. So when he finally showed up, we had a nuclear holocaust of an argument. We were both calling my mother independently saying, you've got to come out here and save us because we're going to kill each other. And she said, I'm not getting in the middle of that. So we went to our separate corners and avoided each other. And a couple of days later, he dropped me off at milepost 165. If you go to milepost 180 on the Natchez Trace, that is the geographic middle of Mississippi. And there's an astronomical observatory there because that is the darkest sky east of the Mississippi River, to give y'all a sense of how much nothing is in the middle of Mississippi. And I started walking from there, and at milepost 167, I got this horrible stomach cramp. Now, I'm girly, I said that, but I'd gotten used to going to the bathroom in the woods on the trace. A lot of the restrooms were closed because of government shutdowns, and a lot of them were really far off the road. I wasn't adding miles to a day to use one of those. So I'd gotten used to going and doing what I needed to do, but I was violently ill next to a pine tree. I was sobbing, too sick to go on. I got out my cell phone to call my dad to say, come pick me up. I'm too sick to finish. I didn't have a cell signal. So I went into my backpack and got out the only thing I had to clean up, a big bottle of Gatorade. And I took the lid off and dumped it around back there and swished it around. And if you're ever in that predicament, don't do that. So I cleaned up as best I could, got back out on the road, sobbing, looking at my phone, saying, as soon as I have a signal, I'm calling my dad and I'm telling him to come pick me up because I quit. This is the stupidest idea in the history of ideas. Nobody's buying this book. Nobody's putting me on the news. Nothing's going viral on the internet, and I'm a failure and I want to go home. 2 miles later, I couldn't even succeed at failing. I didn't have a cell signal. So I collapsed in a field and said, maybe eventually Roy Watkins will wonder where I am and he'll come find me and take me back to South Carolina because I'm done. And I lay in that field feeling really sorry for myself for about 15 minutes. Now, the South is a really pretty place in the spring. March is usually really pretty. It's before we get all that super humidity we have in the air, and the sky was really open and blue. Everything was budding out and blooming. And I was lying in this field of thousands of daffodils. And I said to myself, I've been doing this walk like I live my whole life. I've been rushing through every day to get finished because I'm focused on how much my feet hurt and how miserable I am. And so I'm missing all the amazing things that are happening to me because I'm walking a highway nobody walks by myself. Thousands of birds were migrating. They were everywhere. A deer walked right here next to me one day for a while and didn't run away. A woodpecker stayed with me all day one day, and it plunked trees on either side of the road like we were talking. So I was having magical experiences with nature, and people from as far away as Japan were stopping and telling me what the trace meant to them. And I was missing all that because I was focused on the misery and the agony of what I was doing every day. We do that today, don't we? Man, probably especially today. We have so much bad news every time we open the news. We're bombarded. It's just a tsunami of bad and stressful, and we're isolated, and we love people who are sick and maybe dying, and we've lost people, we've lost businesses, and there's so much to be upset about and worry about and outraged about right now. So it's hard to find the amazing thing in every day. But life is amazing. And that's another thing that I've taken away from this experience anew. Every day is a gift. And so wake up and find the amazingness in every day, because it's there every day, even now, if we choose to see it. I finished my walk right on time, and I did my talk at Ann Patchett's bookstore. I sold a few copies of To Live Forever, not enough to hit the New York Times bestseller list, but I did that with my second book, my memoir about this adventure, Not Without My Father. And there's a lot of other stuff that happened to Dad and me in there that I hope you'll want to read about and listen to. But the best thing that came out of this whole thing ended up being the 5 weeks I spent with my 80-year-old dad, who drives me insane. Another thing that we've learned over the past almost year, I think, is nothing is guaranteed. You know, we live our lives normally, and we think, I'll make those memories with those people when I have time, or when I have money, or when I retire, or when I have more vacation, or we'll do those things next year. And then something like this happens, and we're all sitting here in our houses going, wow, we can't do those things now if we want to, and maybe we'll never have a chance to do them again. And it's really sobering to think about all the I wish I had that we might have. I'm not trying to dredge up all those for you. I'm optimistic that we're going to be out there again, and we're going to be able to make memories in a meaningful way with people who matter. So when we can, don't wait to do that. One of the ways that we don't need to go back to normal, what normal was, is being too busy for making memories that matter. Turn your I wish I hads into I'm glad I did as soon as you possibly can. Because I'm so glad I did this with my dad. If COVID hadn't happened, we wouldn't be able to do this now, because he's too infirm to do it. So we made that memory when we could. And I'm so glad. And you will be too. Please let me know. I open my email still after several years of this book coming out. It's been published in South Korea, so I hear from people in Southeast Asia about memories they've made. And the stories that readers share with me about how they turned this story between Dad and me into their stories is what makes stories worth telling. It's what makes this story powerful. Not that it's about me, but it's what you do with it and how it changes your lives that matters, and why I continue to do this several years after the book came out. I have a special for you that I'll send to Scott. I'll send the link to him when this is done. You can get all 4 of my books, 3 books in the Nowhere series of afterlife, historical, fiction, thriller, paranormal stories of Meriwether Lewis and other people from history. James Wilkinson is the man who is the villain in all my novels. And the 3rd novel actually in part takes place on Blennerhassett Island. So it partially happens in Ohio. So I hope you'll want to read that. But he was the greatest scoundrel that America ever produced. He worked for the first 5 presidents of the United States. He was court-martialed 3 times and got off 3 times. And we only found out 30 years after he died that he committed treason his entire career, even while he was head of the United States Army. He was selling our secrets to Spain for millions of dollars in today's money. So he was deliciously awful, and is someone we don't learn that much about. And so you can learn more about him and Meriwether Lewis and Theodosia Burr Alston, who's another person. If you've seen Hamilton, the musical, she's dear Theodosia in that musical. So those are the people who are chronicled in that. In the link, you'll have a code to get all 4 books for $9.99. So that's over 60% off the cover price, and they're all one ebook that you can read on any device. If I have time for questions, I'll be happy to take a few questions. I might have gone over a little bit. I hope I stayed.
We're good. We're good, Andrew. We have a few minutes for questions. Who has the first question?
Or you're all There are some on chat.
using-
Sometimes people ask questions on chat. No,
let's take a look and see.
Chip, this is Dana. I have a question.
Tell us what shoes you wore.
oh, what shoes I wore. Okay, I was kind of like Cheryl Strayed in Wild, if you've read that book, where she
Yep.
went to the hiking store, but they sold her a bunch of stuff she didn't need. I just wanted shoes. So they sold me the pair of shoes that they said would get me through the whole trip. And it was a pair of lightweight hiking shoes that kind of looked like tennis shoes. And by the time I got to Jackson, which was 90 miles in, I couldn't get my feet in those shoes. So I went to the hiking and camping store in Jackson to get some of those hiking sandals, those cane sandals, but it was too early. So I bought a pair of Teva sandals and those gel inserts, and I duct taped those in a stack to each of the Tevas, and I'd wear those for a day. And then I had to put on the other shoes. And so I alternated between those to get through to the end.
So Tim, Maggie asked a question. What does your father think of the book?
What does my father think of the book? Well, as long as he was able, he would go on trips like this with me so that he could get up and talk. He thinks he is the most famous man in South Carolina. He loved going out and selling this book to people. It gave him an excuse to go up and talk to strangers and tell his stories like he loves to do. So when the book hit the New York Times bestseller list, I called him and said, Dad, your book, you're on the New York Times bestseller list this week. And he said, yeah, then people up there in New York must like me. So he didn't even know what that meant. But it's not often as a child that you get to give a parent something that you see has made their lives. I always tear up when I talk about this because it really did make his life to have that experience and to be able to be well enough to enjoy that experience for as long as he has. So I'm just really grateful for it, and so is he. What was my favorite place on the Trace? Someone is asking, Scott Whitlock. My favorite place on the Trace has to be Meriwether Lewis's grave. I mean, come on. Because I wrote a book about him, but there are lots of pretty spots. If you haven't been there, it is a great socially distanced and physically distanced vacation because you really can go for a long time and not see another car. A lot of the pull-offs are empty. And so it's a really nice thing to do if you're looking to get away from Ohio if it's still cold and gray by the end of March and want something new to do that you can drive to. What's my writing process? Do I lock myself away? And that is from Dana. Actually, my writing process is I'm a very streaky writer. I'm not structured. I can't outline anything. And so the characters talk to me and I write down what they say. And eventually I make a book out of that hopefully makes sense. I usually get writing residencies to get away and lock myself away for a month or two. And I'm getting ready to leave in 2 weeks to go back to Iceland. I'm writer in residence in a tiny fishing village in northern Iceland called Skagastrand. I was there August and September of 2020. I was really fortunate that the government made an exception for creators to continue their work. And so I spent 2 months there last year and I'm getting ready to spend another 2 here in a couple of weeks. So if you're interested in that, you can follow me on Instagram. I'll post a few pictures here and there of what it's like in Iceland right now. And I think that's all the questions I see in the site.
Jackie's asking you to rephrase or re-say your quote. I wish I had into it. I'm glad I did.
I challenge everyone to turn I wish I had into I'm glad I did, because I'm so glad I did, and you will be too.
That was a great presentation, very entertaining.
Well,
I
thank you.
saw a lot.
It finally came together.
I think everybody really enjoyed it. We appreciate you taking the time and sharing with us your story. I know you had one mission in mind, but it turned into something more personal and more special for you. And it's a great message. So thank you and continued success. And we'll maybe see you on the New York Times bestseller list again. Hopefully soon. Thank you so much.